Hey, Paul.
How's life?
Life is good. You know, I was wondering about this beginning segment things that we do, and I realized that we have set the bar really low when it comes to the quality of these jokes. So I was a little bit puzzling. How can I do even worse? But I think I got it. So why did the mechanical shark become a venture capitalist?
No idea.
To invest in Fintech.
Oh yeah, no, that's low. That's really low.
That's yeah. So let's see if we can do worse next time.
I'll try my best, I promise. But with that, everybody, hello and welcome to this episode of Fintech Daydreaming, the podcast that dives into the world of banking technologies and the ever-changing landscape of fintech companies, with real-life examples from guests and experts across the board. We seek to bring you the insights and stories from new emerging technologies to game-changing disruptive ideas, brought to us by fintech companies seeking to challenge the status quo with revolutionary ideas and big, fantastic dreams. My friends, this is Fintech Daydreaming. Hello, dear listeners, and welcome back. Excited to have you here for this, our fifth episode of the Fintech Daydreaming podcast. That's amazing, Ville, right? We've got to 5 episodes already. In case you're new to the show and interested in hearing what we've talked about in the past and the great guests we've had, then you can find us on all major podcast platforms now and even on YouTube. I'm Paul Krogdahl, and I'm excited to be your host for this episode. As always, I'm joined by my fantastic Finnish friend and co-host, Ville. Moikka, Ville. Mitä kuuluu?
Hey, Paul. Doing really well. I'm enjoying your Finnish, so let's keep working on that.
You set the challenge in the last episode, right? So I have to keep working on it.
I did.
You did.
And it is a 5th episode, like you said, and it feels like a milestone, even though it's not really. But perhaps we should do some kind of a bigger live show or something for episode 10 or 20 or whatever it is. But I just got the thought in my head. Let's keep working on that as well.
Sounds like a good idea. But you know, Ville, I have had a look at the analytics from our podcast so far, even though it's only the 5th episode. And I want to send out a big shout out to our listeners. We've managed to pick up active listeners from all over the world, as far out as Japan, Australia, US, Canada, as well as obviously more locally here in Europe and the Nordics. So a big thank you to you all. I mean, without you, we would just be talking to an empty room here. So thank you. And also, please keep sending those great episode ideas that we've been starting to get. We really appreciate them, and it helps us to plan what we should be putting into episodes going forwards and what guests we should have. But I think it's time for us to get on with the show. As many of you out there know, I have a deep passion for the fintech scene, the same as Ville, and that's the reason why we've got a podcast that's based around fintech. And I've been engaged as a mentor and advisor for a number of fintech companies for a number of years now. In some way, it was, I suppose you could say, my engagement with the fintech scene very early on with the Nordea Accelerator program, Ville, which facilitated some of our early discussions, particularly around blockchain and fintech, right?
Yeah. It's funny how the blockchain topic keeps on popping up in our little podcast series here, but I think that's the reason is that a lot of the things that we worked on together in the early days was based on blockchain. And it's an interesting topic in a sense from this angle as well, because it's a very, very typical technology or a solution looking for a problem, to paraphrase a very commonly used of analogy. It was an interesting time when everybody thought that that particular technology was going to solve every problem in the world. Today, it's something else, but it gave us a good good kind of platform to maybe actually get something working, and that's to a certain extent something we achieved together. What I enjoy a lot about these things is that the patterns, they keep on repeating themselves. If you find a new technology today, it could be quantum computing, or it could be augmented reality, or whatever. Artificial intelligence has been around for a while. These patterns keep on repeating, and then out of these patterns, these circles or these kind of circular processes, always something new comes out, and we then are able to enjoy these new services as they are being created. So
we do.
I wouldn't underestimate the technology first approach, even though it's not very efficient. It actually does produce something sometimes.
No, sometimes it does. You're right. But I'm excited to introduce our guest for this episode. Someone who really is deep-rooted in the fintech scene here in Finland and working to help push the fintech scene globally from Finland. As a guest for this episode, we've got Janne Salminen with us, who is director of Fintech Farm here in Finland. I hope I pronounced your name correct, Janne, and welcome to Fintech Daydreaming.
Thank you. Yeah, you pronounced my name pretty nicely, unlike the Brits usually.
Yes, and I was going to say, I mean, I'm not Finnish, as everybody knows, and as Ville keeps wanting to repeatedly point out to the world, I'm not Finnish. But one of the things that really did strike me when I first came here to Finland was how strong the sauna culture is here. I mean, the world knows about Finland and saunas. And there is no opportunity or scenario where the sauna cannot be made appropriate here in Finland, I've noticed. I mean, even in business, the whole notion of we make no deal until we negotiate the contract in the sauna has been made really obvious to me. And the number of times I've ended up having business meetings in a sauna is fascinating and very high. And as a true Finn, Janne, you're no exception. As I understand it, right? You've made it your mission to have at least one meeting with every new fintech company you meet in the sauna. Correct me if I'm wrong. I mean, I think you've managed to get to about 20% so far in Finland. Is that right?
Yeah, pretty much. So I would say 20%, around 40 different companies I've been to sauna with the co-founder.
Have you had any foreigners that are sort of looking at you weirdly when you say, "Hey, let's go to the sauna"?
Some people have been a bit amazed, but then for instance at Slush we invited also foreign fintech entrepreneurs to the sauna, and after all they were really fascinated about it.
Fantastic. I think it's really cool. I like it. Let us know when you get to to 50. Maybe we need to celebrate that.
I will.
But I guess we need to start with the obvious question here now, right, Janne? Why don't you share with us who or what is Fintech Farm, and how are you supporting the fintech scene here in Finland?
Sure. So Fintech Farm is a fintech hub here in Finland, Helsinki. More specifically, we are a platform helping companies in the industry to grow and collaborate. Our background is that we're part of Hub 13, which was the first independent startup hub here in Helsinki. We started in 2014. And in the beginning, we didn't have any industry focus. We had a strong belief in that startups and corporations should collaborate. And then around 5 years ago or late 2015, we really saw that the fintech industry is trending, and there's a lot of discussion going on between the collaboration between banks and fintech startups, for instance. So then we started to focus a little bit more on that industry. And then after working with the fintech companies here in Finland for a year or two, we established the Fintech Farm.
Excellent. Cool. Is it only Finnish fintechs, or is there also foreign fintechs that are trying to get in and involved in the Finnish market?
So, yeah, we help in many different directions. So primarily, we want to help Finnish fintech companies here in Finland to grow outside of Finland. We also do want to help Finnish banks to innovate, to find partners, particularly from Finland, but we also have networks around Finland. And then we also help help foreign companies to land into Finland. And we do have also foreign banks as partners who are looking to find new interesting fintech companies from Finland. So we work in multiple directions.
Yeah, I suppose there's quite a close sort of community, if you could put it that way, between the Nordic banks in the region. How is the fintech scene seen from your perspective in Finland compared to the other Nordic countries?
So in general, the Finnish startup industry is pretty strong and vibrant. We know in the last 10 years there's been happening a lot of new startups, industries, success stories, Slush. So the Finnish fintech industry is very vibrant, but I would say it's quite young. So most of the companies are less than 5 years old. We can see that the real big boom started in 2016. Probably that's when PSD2 and blockchain became like really big things, making the headlines. So there's a lot of going on in the Finnish fintech industry, but we do not have yet big success stories, unicorns like we do have in the gaming industry, for instance, or like they do have in the fintech industry in Sweden. So in Sweden, it's more mature. They have unicorns and they have second generation fintech entrepreneurs. In Denmark also, they have a bit more bigger companies. So Finland is a bit behind in the maturity level, but it's very vibrant and moving fast.
And now that we've mentioned the Slush conference twice in this episode already, Janne, could you briefly just explain for the two people that might not know listening, that what is the Slush conference?
Yeah, so Slush is a technology conference started pretty much from the university entrepreneur societies, and around that it was supported by a few successful entrepreneurs. It was originally an event for startups and investors to meet. Maybe 2013, give or take a few years, was the first time. And then it has been grown into one of the biggest tech conferences or startup conferences in the entire Europe. And it's not only considering really startups and investors, but it's also a place for any sort of corporations to come and see and learn how the future will look like.
I've got to admit, I've attended the Slush conference a couple of times, and I understand they're even now kicking off Slush in Asia. But you're absolutely right. It is both large companies and small companies. And Ville, you know my passion for Porsche, right? I was amazed when I was there a couple of years ago and saw that Porsche actually had a big stand there, looking for developers to help them with some of their open source style development approaches for software in their new cars. It's really cool and interesting.
Yeah, and I personally enjoy the Slush conference, or the time of the Slush conference in Helsinki, in particular, because there's it's almost like a festival that's not only in the conference venue, it's really on the streets everywhere. There's a lot of side events going on. So even if you don't have a ticket to the Slush conference itself, there's a lot of things going on, and plenty of opportunities to meet global leaders really in technology coming into Helsinki to talk to startups, and indeed even the startups themselves coming to Helsinki to meet possible investors and other corporates that they might be working with. And even though fintech is just a small part of it, or I would say more and more significant part every year, it is really kind of technology geeks dream week, if you will. Unfortunately, this year it's not going to happen, not at least not in the way that it used to, due to the COVID situation. But hopefully in 2021 again, it will be up and running.
I could also add here that it's not anymore just a conference. It's a big thing that makes Finland a centric part in the startup industry in the world. So it has really brought Finland reputation as a startup center.
So now it's got a reputation of startup center and saunas. You see, Finland is growing, right? It's fantastic. But actually, going slightly back on topic again, talking about the fintech scene in Finland versus the rest of the Nordic. Ville, you working for one of the largest banks here in the region. How do you see the difference between the fintech scene in Finland and the other Nordic countries where you guys are getting engaged in this?
I think there's a lot of similarities to start from the other end of that question between the Nordic countries. And I think some of these topics we've perhaps touched upon in earlier episodes as well, which is that there's a kind of a culture, or there's strong infrastructure for digital services, has been for a long time in the Nordics. I remember using e-banking for the first time already in the 90s, and when I entered the technology scene in the early 2000s, I couldn't believe that there are countries in the world where e-banking didn't exist. Obviously, it has since, of course, developed all over the world in an exponential rate, but and even past the Nordics. But this kind of culture of already having a lot of digital things built on a strong foundation of digital identity as well is, I think, coloring the whole Nordic scene in terms of fintechs as well. So there's the similarities. I think the overall trust in the government by its population by large, compared to many other countries, strong digital identity, strong internet connectivity. So the proliferation of internet connections in households is one of the highest in the world in all the Nordic countries, and this is also coloring the fintech space. I think comparing the fintechs from US or UK or even Africa or Asia, the focus on what I would say more of infrastructure things instead of the front end is a kind of common theme, I would say, here. And yeah, a lot of the solutions, they rely on these infrastructure components that exist, typically the authentication, identification, and digital signature schemes that exist in all the Nordic countries, whereas in other places where they have to assume that these services don't exist, the services might have a little bit of a different focus.
Yeah,
so
absolutely.
That's my one of the observations that I've had in this space. But I think it's an interesting environment, definitely advanced due to these infrastructure pieces being in place already.
Absolutely, the Nordics is extremely advanced when it comes to digital and digital services and digitalization, even across the board from not just banking but government services, etc. And there are a lot of cool new ideas that keep coming out. Most of them that I've seen seem to be focused on taking existing banking products and just trying to make them better, or almost putting a new shiny front end onto existing products and banking products and services, rather than having outside of the box great ideas and thoughts. I'm just wondering, Janne, have you come across any fintechs, or have you got any great examples of some fintechs that you're working with that really are pushing the boundary and coming out with some great new ideas in this space?
So in general, I could divide fintech companies into three categories. So we would have the so-called sustaining innovations who are here to help the existing companies and business models. Let's take, for instance, a traditional bank. They have tons of people working in the back end processing something, and there comes a fintech company who helps them to digitalize, speed up, and automate something in the back end. That's a very, very popular fintech industry here in Finland. And why not? Because it makes a lot of sense to sell banks something which is easing their billion euro costs in the back end. Then we do have the so-called disruptors or challengers. The most well-known ones are obviously the neobanks, who are creating banks in a slightly different way. They are always making the headlines. They are getting a lot of investments. But after all, they are not that disruptive. They are the same thing in a shinier, nicer, faster, more agile package. Then if we look into companies that would be really disruptive, in one way you could think, like for instance, peer-to-peer businesses like peer-to-peer lending would be a disruptive industry, because they are trying to work around the existing format of having a bank. But after all, those are quite old companies who we have in the market, and I think that's already kind of an established business that has settled in the world, and they live pretty nicely in parallel with the existing banks. So even that one isn't like that disruptive. The truly disruptive companies would be something that try to really change the world. That would be something like distributed self-working organizations working on blockchain with some AI, automatic decision making, programmable money. Those are the concepts that could really change the world. They're very interesting to follow. Most of the time I see someone speaking about that, I'm like 50-50 if that's insane or if that's genius. I don't personally think, we don't have those in Finland, and I don't personally think Finland would be the first place to see those. It could perhaps be an African country where they do not have this kind of a strong legacy infrastructure.
If you look at almost all the blockchain companies that truly want to be disruptive, they almost always also break existing law. So they are not really by definition compliant with existing regulation and law. But something that I actually heard in Slush conference a couple of years ago, Andreas Antonopoulos, who is one of these public advocates for Bitcoin and blockchain technologies, once said in the Slush conference that everything interesting in the world started off as illegal. And I think that is a bit of an interesting kind of provocative statement, but Janne,
but it is true.
Do you think, and yeah, Paul as well, do you think this is actually something that has to be done? Do you have to break the law, especially in financial services, or at least bend the law in order to be truly disruptive?
I think in financial services, there is a much higher focus on compliance, right? So I think in general, most new innovations have been driven by people trying to bend the law. If we look at where Spotify came from, right, it did come from the sharing of music in a possibly non too legal way. What do you think, Janne?
Yeah, I would also agree on that one. You need to do something and be brave and harass the authorities to move forward. But in this case, like I said, Europe is very like stably regularized. So I don't believe that the big impact or the big new wave would happen first here in Europe. It could be much easier to do in some developing country or somewhere else where the regulatory environment is not that stable,
yeah,
or specific.
And I think therein also lies the problem for regulated financial institutions like banks working with companies like this. By definition, the banks are regulated, licensed, and monitored and supervised by these competent authorities in all these countries, and they simply cannot bend the rules. They cannot work with companies that don't comply. So it's a fine line when you walk, especially when you work with these more disruptive companies in a regulated space. Typically, they don't really mix at all. So there has to be some kind of advancement in the interpretations of existing law and regulations that is commonly accepted by everybody before we can move, or banks in general can move into these spaces. But it doesn't mean that the progress should stop. I think these challenges are needed for the industry to go forward. We just need to be really, really careful when we do that.
I think that's an interesting point, Ville. I am seeing a rapid sort of increase in the banks, the traditional banks, that collaborating more and more with fintechs. Right at the beginning, there was this notion that the fintechs are coming, they're going to disrupt banking, and the banks are dead as we know it. But we're seeing more and more of a almost symbiosis happening, right? The fintechs need the banks because the banks understand regulation, they understand how to work in a regulated environment, and the banks to a certain degree can benefit from the technology-driven, hip and trendy world of the fintechs. But you sitting on the banking side, how do you feel that the banks are reacting to to these new kids on the block that are coming along with all these hip and trendy new ideas?
I think it's a mixture of being a little bit scared and a little bit how should I put it? Envious, I guess is the word.
Envious. That's cool.
Yeah, because when you are a small company with a very focused agenda, so if you come into fintech and you want to solve a kind of a great customer experience for a single product or a single customer segment, you can be really fast and efficient in doing those services. Anybody who works in a bank understands that there's so much legacy, which we keep on talking about. But there's also all these processes, and there's also all the existing services and products that you need to drag along with you. You just don't have the same focus and agility as these small companies have by definition. And that's why it's a lot of people working in the banks are just looking at these guys and girls going ultra fast and thinking, oh, wow, I really hope that we could be able to be that fast in developing new customer propositions. And this is almost like sparring the banks to be faster and more agile. And we've seen these things happen. Even the methodologies in most of the Nordic banks have changed towards more agile. There are more and more independence given to certain units, for example, who want to deploy DevOps type of operations, for example. So there's kind of evolution happening. So that's the kind of learning side. So looking at these startup companies, fintech companies, and taking some cues out of those operational models and seeing if the banks can be more agile. They can never compete. I mean, they can never be as fast, but they can take some cues. Then the other side of that is that is there a model where the banks can work together and kind of come to a place where you can benefit from the experience and stability or relative stability of a bank and gain the fast moving forward customer proposition development of these fintechs. And I think that's also increasingly happening, not only through the regulatory aspect, which is of course PSD2 and open banking, but I think all of the banks in the Nordics and I'd say globally anyway, even in the world, has some kind of a fintech collaboration program going on. And these are based on partnerships and mutually beneficial partnerships. And I think this is an interesting way to get the best of both worlds, if you will. The only kind of asymmetry and issue that I see in that is that the banks tend to be also slow in their decision making and making commitments in terms of finances. And sometimes these fast-moving small companies don't have the time to wait for those decisions to come through. And understanding this kind of clock frequency difference between banks and fintechs is a key factor in making it work between these two entities as well. It's a lot of opportunities and a lot of challenges. I think a lot of it is positive though.
Absolutely. Janne, I'm wondering, with the fintechs that you're working with, do a lot of them get very frustrated by the pace of change and the slow moving large banks? Yeah,
absolutely. So I would add to what Ville said. So obviously all the banks at least say that they are fintech friendly and they want to collaborate. And why wouldn't they say? Nobody wants to sound like a boring. They would like to rather sound like a cool fintech bank. But honestly, it is very, very difficult. There are many challenges. Banks are very slow in the decision making. Fintech company might run out of funding. While the bankers are discussing should we move or not, and there are also challenges with the maybe legacy technology and also compliance. The risk screening processes could be really long. So there are many challenges for fintech companies to collaborate with. I know particularly the risk processes has been like blocking most of the interesting companies the banks have been finding. So now there are some workarounds in the market. So there are many trusted service providers like, let's say, AWS or Salesforce or Temenos, who are building their kind of marketplaces where they would take part of the load of integrating into a fintech company, and then the bank would technically have to only deal with the trusted vendor they already have.
No, it's definitely a minefield out there. So kudos to all the fintechs that actually manage to grow and build these partnerships with the banks. But my friends, now for something completely different. It's time to move on to the end segment of our show, where we basically go off tangent and talk about something completely different, just for the fun of it. And Ville, Janne, the headlines last week, this week, and I'm sure will continue, has been filled with the fantastic explosion of Wirecard, right? And the missing, 1.5 billion euros? CEO resigns. 2 Philippine banks who are stating they know nothing about this, but they're supposed to have the money. This is, for a fintech that's grown so fast, it's a catastrophe. I'm just going to leave it hanging out there. What do you guys think?
Yeah, maybe I'll take a swing at this first. Janne, you can kind of see where I got these things wrong. But I think by the time this episode will be out, probably we will have learned a lot more about this story. But as we speak, the things you just mentioned have happened. I think the last thing I read was that Wirecard was going bankrupt. So they've kind of filed for bankruptcy.
Yes.
Again, we'll see where this story is by the time this comes out. But I think what's interesting here is that, first of all, I mean, Wirecard has been working with a lot of fintechs. Even I think most of the neobanks at some point in time have used Wirecard services for their card processing. Some of them have moved out. Maybe they saw something earlier on, or maybe they didn't. But in any case, Wirecard has a history of working with very early stage companies in terms of card processing and financial services. And it seems like a lot of these risks that are perceived in this area have been materializing in one form or another. The tendency to take a lot of risk on the card, how should I say, the brand of the card and or the user or the integrator of the service or service provider, in terms of gambling sites, for example, that have been their customer base in early stages, and some of the cryptocurrency companies that they've been working on, for example. All service providers that typically would be probably turned down by more traditional financial service providers. So they've been taking a lot of risk. They've been growing really fast. But at the end of the day, Wirecard was a regulated institution. And I think the bigger story here is that where did the supervisory elements of this fail? With all the regulation and licenses in place, and for all we know, properly done as well, it took a fair amount of time for this story to break out. I think the first rumors of that there might be something going on was more than a year ago. And yet, yes, we are just now seeing this happening. And even then, it was Financial Times that blew the whistle really on that story rather than any kind of formal authority. So yeah, I think the bottom line here is really that, is there something we can do? Perhaps there's a fintech out there that could help with this reporting, monitoring, and transparency elements of these companies. For all we know, the money that's now perceived to be missing, or it was never there in the first place. We should have known that. The proper authorities should have known that automatically, not by a single person, whoever it was, who forged those bookkeeping records. This should have been automated. There should be automatic detection of all of this. I mean, it's probably just an engineering daydreaming to think about that could happen, but I'm sure it's technically possible. And maybe that's the lesson learned here. We should automate a lot of these things.
Absolutely. I mean, they're bringing down a lot of people with them, right? I believe SoftBank is being heavily affected, and so all the stockholders and in this story. But Janne, what's your view on this?
So yeah, I think Ville Ville covered most of what I had in my mind, but in general, there has been quite a lot of discussion recently about regulating the new banks, because you're a bank and you want to grow fast. That's kind of a dangerous combination. Even the old-fashioned bankers have been complaining that it seems that the new banks are kind of playing with different rules, even though they have the same license in the same country, but that they would still be in kind of a looser regulatory environment. And now I think this could be kind of a eye-opener for everyone, the regulators, etc., to see if that's actually the case, and if we should start to regulate and pay more attention on all these kind of new era banks who are growing really fast. And we really have got a lot of new of those players into the Europe in the recent years.
Yeah, absolutely. I think you're right, both of you. This does fall down to regulations and following the regulations. So there's no surprise that there's a growing area around RegTech, right? So maybe that's a future episode for us there, Ville.
Yeah.
Having a deep dive into RegTech. But unfortunately, my friends, as always, time flies when you're having fun and interesting discussions. And it's time for us to close yet another fantastic episode of Fintech Daydreaming. But before we close, Janne, Ville and I would like to give you a chance to let all of our listeners know how can they find you going forwards, how can they get in touch with you, and what else is lined up for the future of the Fintech Farm.
Yeah, so at Fintech Farm, we are very, very interested in helping anyone who is interested in the Finnish fintech industry, whether you're a bank or you're a fintech company, you want to engage with the Finnish community, you can get in touch. The easiest way is just to get to our webpage, helsinkifintech.fi.
Fantastic. Thank you. And thank you again for coming on the show. It's been a really interesting, riveting discussion. I've really enjoyed it. I'm sure Ville has as well. Mm-hmm. And I'd like to say thank you to all of our great listeners out there. Again, like I said at the beginning, a big shout out to you. Thank you for the growing number of you that's listening in to us. Now, if you have a fintech subject you would like Ville and I to cover in the future in any of the episodes, or maybe you've got a great story yourself or a point of view that you'd like to share with us and the listeners, then please ping us on either LinkedIn or via the Anchor FM page, or reach out directly to Ville or myself on Twitter or LinkedIn or any of the other channels. We'll put the links in the episode description. But Ville and I will be taking advantage of the great, fantastic summer that we're having here in Finland this year. Record temperatures. I was out for a walk last night. It felt like I was in the Mediterranean. So we're taking a break. So this is the last episode for a little bit of a time. But we will be back after the summer. I think, Ville, we agreed early August or mid-August, right?
At the latest, mid-August.
At the latest, mid-August will be the next episode. Absolutely. So thank you, Janne. It's been fantastic. Thank you, Ville. Thank you, everybody. This has been Fintech Daydreaming.